Malcolm, thank you very much for the opportunity and the invitation to come and talk today. Hopefully I can provide some insight and maybe some interesting insight into the fashion industry. And it's worth noting that the industry, in spite of people's views around fashion, is a truly global and massive industry. It's worth at least $1.7 trillion of trade each year. So this is a very significant sector of the industry, a very significant sector of global and world trade. What I'd like to do is share my screen, and I'm going to try and cram in 11 weeks of undergraduate teaching into the space of about 40 minutes. So I'm hoping this will all work for everyone. If it goes too fast, do wave at me and tell me to slow down. But as you'll see as I go through this, it's an area that I'm really passionate about. It's an area that I've been involved in for many years. So if I do get carried away, just give me a quick shout, and we'll slow down and get to any questions at the end of the session. So I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully you can all see the slide deck as we go through today. So the aim of today is really to talk about sustainable fashion and what does that mean, and some definitions and some clarity about fashion, its role within society and within culture and within the economic framework that we have, but also to try and dispel some of the myths that are floating around the industry. So as Janie pointed out, I mentioned, my name is Mark Sumner. I'm from the School of Design at the University of Leeds. The School of Design was the original Yorkshire College of Science that was the basis for the University of Leeds. So the School of Design is one of the foundations for the University of Leeds. And we have a very long track record, a long history of being involved in research and teaching around textiles and fashion. In terms of my background, I studied textile engineering as a PhD. And as part of that, sorry, there's a phone going in the background, it will go off in a second. But as part of my research into textiles, I became really interested in the sustainability opportunities that are available and some of the challenges that we face around the industry. When I finished my PhD, I then went to work in retail. I worked for a brand that some of you may be aware of, a small corner shop called Marks and Spencer's, and worked for them for about 15, 16 years. And I was involved in many aspects of that product design and development process, and I was engaged in talking with and working with cotton farmers and every single stage of that production process that's involved in turning raw material into that finished product. I was the sustainability specialist at M&S as well. And when I decided to leave retail, and I left retail for very specific reasons associated with consumers, which I'll touch on in a while, I then decided I wanted to go into research. And I'm now a university lecturer at the University of Leeds, involved in looking at research and teaching around sustainability, corporate social responsibility, microplastics, modern slavery. And if we have time, we can talk about jam recipes as well, although that might be slightly outside of scope of what we're aiming to cover today. One of the things that we do at University of Leeds is we're involved in real projects, looking at real solutions to sustainability and what's going on in the fashion industry. And we also engage with lots of different stakeholders. So, for example, we've talked to people like Stacey Dooley to help her understand what the industry is all about. And more recently, I was involved in a BBC programme with Patrick Grant, talking about sustainability and fashion. So hopefully what we'll talk about today will have some resonance in terms of some of the realities that we see within the fashion industry, rather than just a very sort of theoretical background from an academic point of view. And of course, sustainability is really important and has become more important over the past few years. And the need to act now around sustainability is unquestionable. And if we carry on in the same pattern of consumption and the same pattern of behaviours that we have as a species, by 2030 we're going to be in a situation which is referred to as the perfect storm, where population would have increased by 33% over that period. But not only is population expected to rise by a third, each and every person on the planet will also have greater demands on the planet's resources. We are seeing for each and every extra person on the planet, there'll be a 50% increase in demand for food, a 30% increase in terms of water consumption, and a 50% increase in energy demand. And of course, what we're also seeing is a greater demand for clothing. And that demand for clothing is going to have significant impacts. Now, the first myth that I want to address today is this myth that some of you may be aware of, and it's definitely something that's talked about in academic circles and within the industry, that the fashion industry is the world's second most polluting industry. Now, I tried to do some research to understand where that particular statement came from, and I still do not know where that statement comes from. So I would argue that the industry is not the second most polluting industry in the world. However, it is a very significant industry. As I mentioned already, $1.7 trillion of trade is associated with the fashion industry. Everybody, virtually everybody on the planet, is wearing and buying clothes in a regular fashion. And as a result of that, there will be significant impacts in terms of things like greenhouse gas emissions. There's also significant impacts associated with water consumption. And particularly, and a particular focus for the UK government at the moment is also the amount of waste that's generated, particularly post-consumer waste, waste that's generated by the fashion industry. Now, we know when we start looking at the data, and I would reference the Global Fashion Agenda report of 2020, which is downloadable off the web, which gives a really interesting view of the impacts of the industry, is that the data tells us that potentially the industry is responsible for about 4% of the total greenhouse gas emissions that are released annually. Now that is equivalent to the greenhouse gas emissions from the UK, Germany and France combined every year. And these emissions are spread across the full life cycle of fashion products. And we'll talk about the life cycle in a bit more detail as we go through today's session. But it's interesting when we think about 4% of greenhouse gas emissions, which obviously sounds like a lot, but that does represent the clothing and the fashion that we all wear. And it represents 7.9 billion people wearing clothing. So when we think about 4% of greenhouse gas emissions, we actually could start to argue and say, well, is that a lot in comparison to every single person that engages in fashion? That's 7.9 billion people. Now, I'm not arguing at all that we should rest on our laurels and say that 4% is okay. We should be looking at how we can improve the greenhouse gas emission footprint for fashion. But it's actually trying to build this into context in terms of the scale of the clothing and fashion industry. Now, what you can see on the screen here is this greenhouse gas emissions in relationship to the full life cycle. And that life cycle can be broken down into three key areas. The first area is upstream production, which I'm going to focus on quite a lot today. And that's all about raw materials and how those raw materials are turned into product, and all of the sustainability issues associated with that. The second component of that life cycle is what happens in terms of retailers and brands. And that's highlighted here in orange on the screen. And as you can see, that actually is only about 6% of the overall footprint. So retailers and brands, when we strip out the product itself, only contribute about 6% of the total greenhouse gas emissions associated with the industry. About a quarter of all the greenhouse gas emissions are associated with you as consumers and the stuff that you buy and how you use that stuff, and then what you do with that clothing at end of life. So almost a quarter of the greenhouse gas emissions are associated with you as the consumer. So when we're looking at that overall footprint, it's interesting to see how greenhouse gas emissions are spread out across the full life cycle. And it's interesting to be thinking about that full life cycle, because when we look at that, what we realize is the fashion industry is actually an industry of industries. It's not just one industry that leads to the creation of product that we all wear in terms of clothing. The clothing industry is an amalgamation of all sorts of different industries. There's the apparel industry itself in terms of creating that clothing. There's the textile industry as a separate entity, but very closely connected to apparel, which is all about creating yarns and fabrics and colouring those products. The textile industry itself is very much dependent on agriculture. Over 50% of all the products that we wear are going to be made from agricultural outputs: cotton, angora, cashmere, and wool, for example. The textile industry is also very dependent on the chemical fibre industry. This is the industry that's creating polyesters and nylons and elastanes. We're also, the industry of fashion is also reliant on the chemical industry in terms of providing specialist finishing for fabrics, and also the coloration for fabrics. So when we think about that $1.7 trillion of businesses associated with the fashion industry, what we're talking about there is amalgamation of different industries that all support ultimately the delivery of fashion to the consumer. And when we're looking at the sustainability of the industry, we're not just going to focus on greenhouse gas emissions. As important as that is, we need to be thinking about all sorts of different aspects of the industry and its sustainability. Now, when I started working in the industry back in 2007, or started to focus on sustainability, there were two main issues that we thought we had to address. The first was about ethical practices within factories, and the second was something to do with cotton production. And back in 2007, we weren't really sure what the issues were with cotton, but there seemed to be something going on there that didn't really quite ring true. So we had to try and work out and understand what was going on back in 2007 around cotton. But if we look at where we are now in 2021 and the impacts the fashion industry has, the diversity and the scale and scope of the industry's impacts goes well beyond just thinking about greenhouse gas emissions. The industry is associated with the use of highly toxic chemicals, for example, which have health and safety issues for workers, but also have toxicological impacts for the environment. We need to be thinking about the impact of the industry on deforestation, for example. The industry can be heavily reliant on non-renewables, i.e. the oil industry. It's also heavily associated with air and water pollution. There are significant issues, not just around the environment, but also in terms of the social impact of the industry. The health and welfare of workers, for example, and their exposure to dangerous conditions and dangerous chemicals. Within the agricultural system, you have issues around bonded labour, forced labour. We have issues around gender inequality across the industry as well. As many of our products are made from animal-based materials, there are issues in terms of ethics and morals in terms of how we treat animals that provide us with those materials. And we're seeing issues associated with workers' rights in terms of are they paid a decent wage? Are they paid on time? Are they forced to do overtime, for example? There's a very, very wide range of issues that are associated with the industry. And all of these have to be taken into account when we're thinking about the sustainability of the industry. And of course, as time goes on, we're seeing more and more new issues being raised in terms of those connections between what the industry does, what this industry of industry does, and the impacts in terms of the environment. And more recently, the industry has been accused of having a very strong link with ocean plastic. And although the data is a bit scarce at the moment, which is why I talk about apparently there is a link between domestic laundry and ocean plastic, what we're seeing is more and more evidence of the fact that when we wash our garments in our washing machines at home, we are potentially releasing microfibers into the sewer system that go through the rivers and end up in the ocean. And we're not sure yet, but there is some evidence to suggest that those microplastics could have a significantly detrimental impact on ecosystems within the oceans. So these new issues are going to continue to arise as we move forward, and we find greater and more links between the industry and what happens in the environment. And one of the things I'm going to be talking about today is this is not just about fast fashion. Luxury fashion, high street fashion use the same factories and use the same materials that the fast fashion industry uses as well. And in some ways, there is an argument to say that some aspects of luxury fashion are significantly more damaging to the environment than fast fashion. And there's a prime example back in 2019 where a very famous luxury UK luxury brand were found to have been burning every year millions of pounds worth of their product, not because there was anything wrong with it, but because they didn't want that product to go out onto the market and damage the rarity of their brand. In 2019, they burnt almost 30 million pounds worth of product. So this is not about just fast fashion. This is about understanding the impact of fashion and clothing in a much wider context and understanding all of those different connections within the industry. And when we start to understand those connections within the industry, what we see is the bulk of the environmental and social aspects are associated with that production phase, that manufacturing phase that I talked about in terms of upstream supply chain. And that upstream supply chain is incredibly complex. And hopefully what you can see on the screen in front of you is a representation of what that supply chain can actually look like. So for example, here we can see fashion retailers at one end of the scale, and all of these different connections with different organizations that do different things to convert those raw materials into the final product. We're talking about cotton farmers, ginners, trading agents, spinners, fabric mills, and we also have dyeing and finishing. We have trading agents who act in between these different points. And of course, we have garment manufacturing. Very complex supply chains that are going on here. But it's even more complex than that, because when we think about certain materials, so for example, we think about viscose, which is shown in the top corner of this particular slide. The actual production process of viscose is highly complex in itself. So trying to understand all of those connections and the environmental impacts associated with all of those very complex relationships is a difficult process. But we know from the scientific analysis of this aspect of the industry that there's a very significant environmental and social impact associated with that production process. And that leads on to this idea of the second myth that I wanted to talk about today. And when we talk about supply chain and when we talk about all of the impacts associated with the supply chain, generally what we find politicians and stakeholders and NGOs and media talking about is the solution to all of these problems is really simple. Brands just need to control their supplies in a much better way. Well, actually, what we know in terms of 99.9% of all of the brands that operate within the fashion industry is generally they do not own their supply chain. And in fact, those brands that do own parts of their supply chain, they only actually own the first part, or the tier one that we refer to as the garment makers. And actually what we look at in terms of the complexity of that supply chain is the garment makers are a very small part of the sustainability issues associated with the industry. The big challenges are associated with going further upstream. So beyond garment makers to dye houses, fabric mills and spinning mills. Those have a very significant impact in terms of water consumption, energy consumption, and they are not owned by the brands. And in many cases, they don't have a direct contract with the brands. So for many brands and retailers, although they want to do the right thing, contractually and legally, it's very difficult for them to get their suppliers to do what they want them to do. And importantly, for many of these suppliers, they don't work for just one brand. They're working for a whole raft of different brands, and it helps them balance up their production, but it also means as a single brand, it's very difficult to get them to do things differently. Now, in terms of that extended cotton supply chain that you can see on the screen at the moment, I've identified in bold some of those aspects of the supply chain that many people don't really are accustomed to being aware of for the fashion industry. So these are people like the ginners who separate the fibre from the cotton fibre from the cotton seed. There are transport agents and traders. There's the cotton growers themselves, but there's also the seed manufacturers and the producers of fertilizers and pesticides. Now, I've highlighted that group in bold because generally they have little or no connection with brands and retailers at all. Those people that work in that particular part of the supply chain are driven by the commodity markets. So there are very large commodity traders like Cargill and Dow and Ecom, who manage the production of cotton, who don't place orders or have any clients that are retailers and brands, and they manage that commodity market. So in terms of a brand and retailer trying to control that supply chain, there is a very significant myth in terms of the connections between the brand and what goes on in the cotton fields, for example. So this makes it very challenging in terms of brands, in terms of how they can try and manage their overall footprint or the footprint of their products. And one of the other myths that is thrown up when we talk about the production process, and in particular talking about the supply chain, is that people talk about, if we made it in the UK, we would have a greener industry. If you could do away with that global aspect of the industry, we could actually be in a situation where our products would be greener. Now, that locally sourced solution may work for different industries, but when we're talking about clothing, particularly clothing that's based on the use of cotton or wool or polyester, one of the big challenges that we have for the fashion industry is we don't produce that stuff in the UK. That material has to be grown in places like Senegal or Mali or Kenya or in India or Pakistan, and then brought over to the UK. So we're not resolving anything in terms of actually that locally produced or locally sourced solution. And more practically, because of the lack of investment and the lack of support from government, we don't have a textile industry of any great scale that would allow us to process or manufacture a product. And one of the key points about this particular myth about locally sourced is we wouldn't make any significant gains in terms of CO2 savings that are associated with transportation. Generally, the fashion industry is really efficient in terms of shipping products around the world, to such a point that the carbon footprint associated with shipping product is so small in comparison to other impacts in that supply chain, we normally ignore them. So that's a really interesting point in terms of understanding the impacts across that life cycle and the potential opportunity for locally sourced clothing as a solution. Sticking with those materials, materials are considered to be the biggest source of supply chain impacts, both environmental impacts, but also potentially social and ethical impacts. And generally, what you can see on the screen, the material footprint for clothing in the UK is dominated by cotton, polyester, and wood. So what we're talking about there is the use of cotton and polyester as being about 3/4 of the overall footprint, and the use of wood. And for some of you, you may be wearing wood today, you may not be aware of that, but wood is a major material for the industry. It's used as the base for viscose, lyocell, and modal materials in our product. So that forms a major part of the UK clothing footprint, those three products. And when we're thinking about these materials, and in particular, thinking about some of the environmental impacts associated and social impacts with those materials, we have to start asking questions about how much water and slave labour are we actually wearing, or are we associated with in terms of the clothing that we're wearing. And actually, when we start looking at the data associated with those raw materials and how those raw materials are manufactured, produced, and delivered to us, we can start to get an understanding of some of those environmental and social impacts that we are absolutely closely associated with as a result of the clothing that we buy. So in terms of how much water we're wearing and how much slave labour we're associated with is very much dependent on, for example, where our cotton was grown. And it's important to highlight here, by the way, that when you look at that label inside your clothing that says made in or country of origin, that has no reference or has no link at all with the raw materials and the sources of the raw materials that were used in making that product. That made in label refers only to the garment manufacturing country. And as I say, it has no relationship at all in terms of where those raw materials came from. But when we start looking at where cotton has come from, for example, we can see that there's huge diversity in terms of the water footprint that's associated with cotton production. So if we were to source cotton from India, for example, we could see that for every cubic meter or every ton of cotton that we purchase, there is associated the amount of water that's used to grow that cotton is very significant. And in fact, what we talk about in terms of cotton production out of India, that for a t-shirt, we're normally talking about 7,000 litres of water is used to grow just the cotton for one cotton t-shirt. But if we were to source our cotton for someone like China, for example, we can see that there's a very significant reduction in that water consumption. However, when we're talking about sustainability, it's not just about environmental impact, it's not just about water footprint, it's also about that social impact. And what we know is that certain countries in the world grow a lot of really good quality cotton. Uzbekistan, for example, produces some of the best cotton in the world. But Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan cotton has been banned by many brands and retailers because the government in those countries engages in forced child labour. These are countries where the dictatorship forces children out of schools to go and pick cotton on behalf of the government so that dictatorship can become more profitable. So when we're looking at the complexity of sustainability, we start to get an idea that some of the challenges that we're seeing here can lead to all sorts of queries and all sorts of questions. And for example, when I mentioned China, there are significant question marks about the Chinese approach to cotton production in Xinjiang and potential discrimination and genocide that is going on in those cotton production areas of China. And this brings us on to the fourth myth that I'd like to talk about today, related to cotton. And in fact, this is a myth that's related to all natural products. And I call this the cotton dilemma. Because when we talk about sustainability, in particular when we talk to consumers about sustainability, there's a general perception that anything that is considered natural is going to be good for the environment, and anything that's considered man-made or synthetic is going to be bad for the environment. But actually what we see in terms of conventional cotton production is that that production is highly dependent on the use of pesticides. And just so we're clear here, pesticides are designed to kill living organisms. And there are a very large number of reports that link pesticides to significant human harm and human fatalities in places like India and Pakistan. The industry is also highly dependent on the use of fertilizers. Now, fertilizers have significant impact in terms of biodiversity, and they're also very carbon intensive. Carbon release associated with fertilizers is very significant. There are significant issues in terms of cotton production around health and safety related to the use of chemicals, but also related to the use of machinery. Bearing in mind, in many cases, whole families will be engaged in cotton production. So that includes husbands, wives, and children. There are many examples of forced labour, and I've already mentioned forced bonded labour, but there are other examples of forced labour on a government level, but also on a local level. Cotton is also associated with poor biodiversity because of the intensive farming practices. And I've already mentioned that cotton is also associated with very significant water use. But what's interesting to bear in mind when we talk about cotton and this dilemma that we face with cotton is that cotton provides employment for over 120 million cotton farmers across the world, and many of these farmers are subsistence farmers in developing nations. And we also know that cotton is a plant that absorbs CO2 from the atmosphere. So that's a good thing that cotton is doing. And importantly, from a GDP point of view, and also from a poverty alleviation point of view, many of the farmers that are engaged in cotton production do so because they get a much higher rate of return, a greater profit, than if they were to grow food crops. And I remember talking to a cotton farmer in India some years ago and asking him why he was involved in the production of cotton. And he was very clear that he was growing cotton because he wanted to send his daughter to university. And the only way that he could afford to do that was to grow cotton. So this myth around natural is better is based on, is created because sustainability is highly complex. And what seems a very obvious choice in terms of greenness is not always supported by science. And what we see sometimes when we look at that science is that synthetic materials are often better for the environment than natural fibers. Now, what you can see on the chart is a bit of a complex chart that shows the results of a life cycle assessment. It is a technical way of measuring environmental footprints. And you can see the different dimensions or the different factors that life cycle assessment has been based on. And the bigger the bar on this chart, or the bigger the column, the larger the environmental impact that bar has. And on this chart, the largest bar by far is that represents cotton. And cotton, grown in a conventional way, is very, very damaging to the environment. And the most sustainable material that we use in the fashion industry is actually polyester, and very specifically recycled polyester. That has the lowest impact by far. So we have this challenge in terms of around nature and is natural better. And actually the challenge here isn't about cotton, the plant itself. It's about the way that we grow cotton. And that's really important that we understand it's this intensive farming process that causes all of the problems for us in terms of sustainability. And when we do this life cycle assessment, and I mentioned LCAs a few times, when we look at that science, we start to get a real big picture of some of the big hotspots for us in terms of that manufacturing process. And what you can see on the screen now is that previous slide I showed you in terms of the emissions for greenhouse gas emissions. But also you can see on there a UK report that shows that there is very significant hotspots around impacts associated with what you as a consumer do, and also the utilisation of garments. And what I mean by utilisation is this idea of how much we use our products for, how long do we keep them for, and how often do we use them. And the more we focus on this, the more that we can see actually there's a very significant link between utilisation and the footprint associated with our fashion products. And what we know by looking at the science and looking at the research is that by extending the life of a garment, we can increase its utilisation. And by increasing its utilisation, we can reduce its environmental impact. And we can reduce its environmental impact because what we're doing by extending the life of that product, increasing its utilisation, is we're deferring the replacement purchase of a new garment. And we know that if we can extend the life of a garment, we can potentially make a significant saving in terms of carbon, water, and waste that is generated by the industry. So we also know that if we can make garments more durable, they are going to have a longer lifetime. They're going to have that opportunity to have an extended utilisation. So therefore, durable garments are going to be better for the environment. So we want to have good quality, durable garments as part of our map to reduce the sustainability risks associated with the industry. And this is where we get to myth 5, this myth associated with fast fashion, that fast fashion is not sustainable. And there may be some aspects of fast fashion that are not sustainable, but one of the things that we found in terms of our research, and this is again counterintuitive, is the quality and durability of many fast fashion products is not determined by the price that you as a consumer pay for that garment. Now, what you can see on the screen is a snapshot of a research project we did a couple of years ago. And what this shows is the price of a pair of jeans, the retail price, and a measure of the durability of that pair of jeans. And what we're talking about here is the abrasion performance. How long does it take for that pair of jeans to wear away into a hole in the fabric? And I've highlighted in bold a couple of examples. I'm going to draw your attention to the example at the bottom of that chart. A pair of jeans that cost £14.90 had an abrasion performance of 60,000 revs. The more revs, the better the durability of that product. Now, when we compare that to a product that cost 10 times as much, a product that cost £145, what we saw with our results was that product had half the durability of the £14.90 product. What the results showed here is actually price is a very poor indicator of quality of product. And therefore, price is also a very poor indicator of the sustainability of that product. And we're starting to see more and more examples of this, that fast fashion products actually, in some cases, can be just as durable or even more durable than some of the products that you might get from a designer label or from a luxury label. The other additional myth that I just wanted to add in here as well, and we won't have time to touch on this in any depth, is that being green does not mean that products are more expensive. And there are plenty of examples within the fashion industry now where there are sustainable products made from sustainable materials that are significantly cheaper than luxury and designer-based products. And we're starting to get a feel in terms of that analysis of the impacts of the fashion industry to start to understand the impacts that the consumer can have in terms of their behaviour. Now, I've already talked about utilisation in some ways related to consumers, and this is this idea that the more that we retain our products and the more that we use them, the lower the carbon and water footprint that is associated with that product. But actually, there's more important aspects of the role that the consumer has in terms of their contribution to the overall impact of the product. And this actually is moving away from the scientific analysis of life cycle assessment and starting to think about consumer behaviour and what we all do in terms of our engagement with fashion and clothing. Now, people have talked an awful lot about consumer behaviour, and particularly more recently, this focus on the growth of the ethical consumer. And a lot of surveys and a lot of market research has suggested that there is a very significant growth in this ideal of the ethical consumer. In a recent report I looked at the other day associated with ethical consumption for fashion suggests that 2/3 of consumers worldwide say that they would boycott a brand if it was found to have a stance on sustainability that didn't align with that consumer. And we are seeing more and more of this idea that ethical consumption plays a bigger role in consumer choices. And we have this idea that ethical consumption has two forms. This idea that we would associate ourselves with positive buying, we would buy from brands and retailers that we believe align with what we want around sustainability. And we also have this idea of ethical consumption, which is about a moral boycott. Now, some of you may have a positive buying approach to your purchasing. I know I have a very clear moral boycott on a number of brands, not just associated with the fashion industry. And potentially the market research is saying that we're seeing more and more of that going on. But actually, this is where we get to myth 6. And this is where I talk about this question about, do consumers actually really care about sustainability, particularly when it comes to this idea about clothing and fashion? Because we know in some ways, consumers' behaviour around fashion seems to be crazy, seems to be irrational. And a great example of this, a terrible example of this, is when we go back to 2013 and the Rana Plaza disaster. So for those of you that may not remember the Rana Plaza disaster, this happened in 2013. It was a factory collapse that led to the death of nearly 1,300 workers in a factory in Bangladesh. And it was caused, by the way, by poor building regulations and the fact that the factory owner rented out the top floor of that factory to a heavy machinery organisation, and that led to that factory collapse. Now, Primark, although didn't have any production in that factory at the time, was very closely associated by the media with that factory. So Primark was being talked about being banned. People were talking about having a boycott against Primark, and Primark had negative press for many, many months after that disaster. But what was really interesting when Primark released their profits, their profit and loss for that period, they saw their profits increase by 44%, in spite of the fact that they were very closely associated with the Rana Plaza disaster. And this is a prime example of where we see this irrational behaviour around consumers. And this idea that potentially what consumers say about sustainability isn't always reflected in their behaviour. And it's really interesting. It's one of the reasons why I left retail. So I left retail some years ago. And one of the reasons I left retail is because I couldn't understand consumer behaviour when it came to sustainability. And I've spent the past 7 or 8 years trying to understand consumer behaviour and that irrationality about what goes on. And actually what we can see around consumer behaviour is starting to understand how our brains work in terms of our approach to purchasing. And actually, our brain is all about trying to drive a feeling of satisfaction. So I've got a cake on the screen here because I'm really driven not by fashion but by cakes. I really am. I'm addicted to cakes, and the reason that I'm addicted to cakes is because I get a great feeling of satisfaction from eating cakes. Or actually, I'm going to talk about it. I get a great alleviation of a discomfort associated with cakes. If I don't eat cakes, I get this pang of discomfort. And what we think about in terms of looking at discomfort and motivation and behaviour is our irrational approach to behaviour can be mapped out in terms of our psychology. But what we're talking about here is we have an actual state. This is where we think about where we are currently. So while I'm talking to you at the moment, I am slightly distracted because in my actual state, I'm really wanting to have a piece of cake. So I have a desired state in terms of where I want to be. I want to have some cake. I want to have that satisfaction of eating cake. Now, the difference between my actual state and desired state creates a tension, and that's a measure of my discomfort. And actually what the psychology tells us is our brains are always trying to alleviate that discomfort. And to alleviate that discomfort, what we do is we engage in a goal objective. And actually that tension is what we call need. I have a need for the cake. And what we can talk about in terms of consumption is that goal objective is a product or a service that is driven by our needs to move from our actual state towards our desired state. So when we talk about fashion, what we're focusing on here is thinking about the needs that fashion is addressing. And actually, the needs that we talk about in fashion are not related to this biogenic need, this idea of protecting us from the environment in terms of keeping us warm or protecting us from cold and wet. It's also not about utility needs, this idea to get a practical benefit in terms of, for example, modesty. But actually what we see in terms of fashion, and we all engage in this in different ways, is this hedonistic or psychogenic need that fashion is incredibly good at achieving. And this hedonistic approach is this idea that we have an emotional connection with fashion. We want to drive some sort of excitement or to improve our self-confidence or self-esteem. Clothing is the most powerful non-verbal communication device that we have as humans. And we use this to express this hedonistic approach to life, but we also use it to express our power and status. And this is associated with psychogenic need. So what we see in terms of fashion is this really complex relationship between our actual state of where we are and that desired state in terms of where we want to be. And that tension creates all sorts of issues for our brains in terms of engaging with fashion. And fashion almost goes beyond hedonism. It goes into our desire. It goes around this intrinsic enjoyment. And what we see in terms of this consumption society, and in particular in terms of marketing, is they use images like you can see on the screen at the moment to try to get us to engage in purchasing fashion with this strange idea that if we buy Marks and Spencer's lingerie or Marks and Spencer's pants, we end up looking a little bit like these people in the pictures. And we might say that that's a very strange way and no one engages in that, but the marketing of fashion is very, very persuasive. And what we see is the marketeers and the industry feeds on this hedonistic approach to fashion and this desire. And in particular, we can see that social media is really powerful in terms of driving people to engage in fashion. So what we see in terms of consumers and their attitude to fashion is it's a highly complex set of relationships that we engage in when we're talking about consumption in general, but also consumption around fashion, because fashion is such an important part of society and culture. And what's really interesting when we look at sustainability and we look at trying to work out who would be more sustainable within our society, particularly around fashion, is we find that sustainable behaviour is not predicted by the normal demographics that we would associate with predicting behaviour. So age, gender, affluence, education, awareness of sustainability are not good predictors of whether we as consumers are going to behave in a sustainable way. So what we see in terms of that issue around consumers is this is a highly complex area, and we can't rely on consumers to be making all of the right decisions around sustainability. So this is where we end up looping back to businesses and brands and retailers. And actually what we're seeing now, more than government, we see businesses taking on the responsibility for managing the impact of the industry. And what businesses do now is part of that negotiation that they have with society and consumers. And this is not new, by the way. This postcard you can see on the screen is from the 1780s. And this is actually a postcard that was created as a consumer backlash to industry in the UK that was heavily reliant on slave labour in the West Indies, in particular sugar and cocoa. So what we can see is this business response to responsibility is not new, but what is new is the level of engagement the businesses are having in terms of managing their impact on the environment. So looking forward to the fashion industry and what can be done, we can see that actually there's a very wide range of brands now engaging in plans for the future. So what you can see on the screen here is a plan of action that the Textiles 2030 initiative has engaged in. And we have a very wide range of brands who are signing up to these initiatives to deliver significant reductions in carbon and water footprint, and to also manage some of those social impacts across the industry. And actually what we can see within those brands that are associated with these initiatives is some of the brands that are associated with engagement with these new models for sustainability are not the brands that you would expect. So we're talking about people like Primark and Next and Asda and ASOS and Boohoo. These are brands that are very much closely associated with fast fashion, but these are the brands who are doing important, real work to reduce the impact of the industry. And they are trying to develop new ways of engaging with consumers to help consumers make some of the right choices around their fashion choices. And just as an example of what some of the brands are doing, you can go onto the H&M website. You can also go onto the Primark website, as well as many other brands. And you can actually go on their websites to see where they're sourcing their products from. So you can start to make some conscious decisions about whether you're going to buy a product based on where those products are coming from. Now, this is not fully developed in terms of the model, but what we're hoping for, and this is my last slide for today's presentation, what we're hoping for is that we'll be in a position at some point soon where you as a consumer can actually start to get a better understanding about the sustainability of the products that you're potentially buying. And what the brands and what the suppliers are doing are they are using new technology and new business models to allow you to engage in this fashion phenomena, for you to buy the clothing products that you want, but at the same time reducing your environmental and social risks associated with your choices. So I've run through that really quickly, and apologies if that's gone a bit too fast, and apologies if there's a bit too much detail in there. But I'm hoping what that gives you is an impression of the complexity associated with the fashion industry and some of the challenges the industry faces in terms of its supply chain, but also in terms of consumers, and also some of the opportunities that are there for brands and retailers to work with their consumers to minimize some of those sustainability issues that are associated with that industry of industries. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll hand back to Janie. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to stop sharing? Yeah, thank you very much, Mark. I think you've raised some very interesting issues, and you certainly have shown the complexity of the issues involved. I think having those myths was quite an interesting way of approaching it. Anyway, I think you need probably have a break and a drink, so maybe you need a break, I'm sure. I'll come back to, maybe we'll give people another minute or so. For Mark. So I'll start with Reinhard. Reinhard, would you like to ask your first question about you were talking about some small ethical brands with direct links. Yes, I mean that's an interesting one. Small. But anyway, you ask a question and maybe see what Mark's response to this.
Yeah, I mean, first I have to sort of self-declare that I'm a member of the consumption liberation movement. So I come from a certain perspective, and I think the best environmental impact for the earth is if we reduce our numbers and if we reduce our consumption. And that is my perspective. So, I mean, that's why I raised these questions. And one question is that if I have to buy clothing, I try to buy as little as possible. I go to brands which trace back to the producers, because Mark, you were saying that it's very difficult. And I can imagine if you try to produce in sell in large amounts, it's almost impossible to have a sort of idea about all your suppliers and what is going on in the supply chain. And I think that is actually part of the problem. I think if you select small suppliers, they even support small brands or small business, they even support and link up to their suppliers and can, according to my information, actually track what is happening and also support the producers in producing environmentally friendly. So I think the problem is the business model of big brands such as Walmart, Marks and Spencer, and so on. Perhaps you can comment on this, on my opinion. Thank you.
Okay, Mark.
Thank you, Reinhard. And in many ways, I completely agree with the opening statement about reducing consumption and that as a solution to many of the problems. But in terms of this idea of big brands and small brands, it's an interesting discussion that's come up many times during my career within the industry, and also in terms of research. And I think my best answer to that would be, irrespective of brand size or retailer size, there are some brands who are really good at what they do, and there are some brands who are not very good at what they do when it comes to sustainability. And I know that there are some very large brands who are making significant progress in terms of traceability about where the products come from or where the materials come from. They're making significant progress in terms of helping their suppliers. And when I talk about suppliers, I'm talking about this extended supply chain all the way back to cotton farmers, for example, that they are making some very significant progress. And as a result of their size and also that progress, they are making very significant reductions in terms of environmental impacts and protecting workers in that supply chain. But at the same time, yes, we see small brands are also very nimble, and they also have made some very significant impacts in terms of what they're doing. So I tend to move away from this idea that big brands are worse than small brands, or small brands are better than large ones. There is a real mixed bag, a real diversity in terms of what people are doing. And I think actually we really need to support some of the big brands to get them to move quicker and faster towards a more sustainable approach to what they're doing. But there are, as I say, some very good brands at a large scale that are doing the right things. Although there are, as I say, brands that are not doing the right thing. And, you mentioned, for example, Walmart. Now, Walmart have been associated with all sorts of bad practice in terms of how they manage their supply chain. And I suspect as time goes on, and we're seeing this already, that institutional investors and stakeholders and shareholders are going to start to rebel against some of those bigger brands in terms of saying, you're not doing the right thing. Therefore, I'm going to withdraw my support for you. So there's some really interesting dynamics that are going on. I'm not sure if that answers your question, Reinhard, but that's the sort of view that I've had in terms of the experience I've had in the industry so far.
And I think maybe coming in as a follow-up to that, I think the problem is sometimes with the small brands, which are quite exclusive and can follow through on chains, they're often high-end, not always high-end, and there's a cost issue. For a lot of people, cost would be a big issue. So, I think that's an interesting point you're making, Mark, that, the importance of working with some of the bigger brands who can produce, at a cheaper rate, but making sure they're doing it in a sustainable and ethical way is obviously important. Okay, so let me now come on. I'll jump over your next one, Reinhard, but I promise I'll come back and I'm sure Malcolm will make sure that I do. There's one from Harvey. Harvey, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, just a quick one. Thanks very much. It's really interesting talk, Mark. Just any comments you can make about the role of recycling for the clothes industry, increasing sustainability?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point, and I'm going to be quite precise in terms of the technical language I use here. So recycling, when we talk about it, is all about recovering the materials that we used in that product. Now, in terms of the hierarchy of how we deal with waste in general, there's some really interesting things that we can do with clothing. Really importantly for clothing is this idea of reuse. So before we get into recycling, with clothing, there's a really big opportunity for us to get to give products a second life. And that fulfills that component I talked about in terms of utilization. If we can give a product a second life and get someone else to use it once we've finished with it, then we are actually minimizing and reducing the footprint that's associated with that product. So always the first port of call for us when we're talking about managing that waste component of the industry is, can we reuse that product with a different person? And organizations like Oxfam, who are based in Batley, just around the corner from me, deal with, or pre-COVID, dealt with hundreds of tons a week of garments, and what they were doing was sorting out those garments that could be reused. And that actually was a double whammy for Oxfam, because not only did it help reduce the environmental footprint of the product, but it also was an income stream for their charity causes in terms of what they were doing. So we talk about that as being the first point of that hierarchy in terms of dealing with the waste. The second point that's important for clothing is repair and remanufacture. And this is this idea that if a garment has failed for whatever reason, and I have to confess, I did hear one of my students a couple of years ago talk to her friend about having to buy a new coat because a button had fallen off her old coat. Now, as she was a fashion student, I was somewhat disappointed that she didn't know how to sew a button on. But this idea of remanufacturing is also important as well. That extends the life of a garment and potentially and also potentially gives it the opportunity for a second life. The middle ground in terms of all of this is actually garments that can't be reused or repaired can be reused for some other sources. So there's a massive business associated with the rag trade, literally a trade in rags. So taking old garments and cutting them into rags that are used in the engineering industry, for example, to mop up oil spillages, for example. So there's some really important stuff that goes on there. And then ultimately, as I get into the technical point of recycling, this idea of recovery of the fibres, yes, that's an important part of what the industry does at the moment, but textile recycling is really basic at the moment. It is based on technology that's essentially 200 years old. And what we do when we recycle textiles generally is we take the old garments, we strip off the buttons and the zips, we chop the fabric up, we then put it through a shredding device and pull it to pieces. And what we're left with is material that is only really good for insulation, whether thermal or whether it's acoustic insulation. So yes, there is a really important part for this contribution in terms of dealing with waste that's associated with reuse and remanufacturing, and also to a certain extent recycling. But the holy grail for the industry is finding a true sustainable way to recycle garments, to get the materials out of that original product and turn it into new materials. Now that is complex, because just looking at the room in front of me, and it's really nice to see some faces on a Zoom meeting, but you're all wearing products that are made of polyester, blended with cotton, blended with elastane, and it's almost impossible to separate those materials to be able to recycle them. So there's a real big scientific, technical challenge associated with doing that. But if we can get there, there's a really fantastic opportunity to really improve the sustainability of the industry.
Thank you that's very interesting, your discussion about that. Yes, I visited that, the Batley Waste Saver place. It's fascinating actually what they're doing there. It's very worthwhile. Okay, Catherine, you had a question. Okay.
Yes, actually the question was from me, not from my wife.
Right, sure.
And my question is, I'm one of these men that hardly ever buys any clothes. And my wife, who's sitting next to me, says this is a result of my low self-esteem. And my question is, how can we change the view of men who hardly buy any clothes of having low self-esteem to actually having ethical values? And I just think we've got to stop. I'm still wearing shirts I bought 35 years ago. I think this has got to be seen as morally good rather than low self-esteem. Now, this is slightly frivolous, but that's my sort of question.
Well, I'm not falling into that trap of getting in between you and your wife, I'm afraid. I'm not going to make any comments on that. But you mentioned self-esteem, and that's a really important thing to be thinking about, not maybe for our generation, but actually it's a growing point, self-esteem for many people. But if we think about that group that's normally associated with fast fashion and this very high turnover of clothing, we're talking about younger generations, we're talking about Gen Z and millennials. And clothing really plays an important part in creating their self-identity when we're all, in fact, if we all think about when we were 15 years old and going to school wearing the wrong shoes or the wrong trousers and the grief that we got, the clothing plays a really important role in terms of creating and helping us create our self-identity. It's also really important in terms of demonstrating and being part of a group. And it does play a role in terms of self-esteem as well. So some of my academic colleagues would talk about this idea that we should just stop fast fashion happening and just make people wear clothes as you do and keep them for 30 years. Now, I'm not saying that that's wrong in any way at all in terms of what you're doing. And in fact, I've got some clothes that are maybe not 30 years old, but definitely 20 years old. And I feel morally justified in looking a bit scruffy because of that. Now, what we do in the world of fashion is we don't say that everyone is the same. We tend to think about fashion being in terms of segments and trying to address the needs of different segments. And I think it's important that we recognize that for young people and actually people who are getting older as well, that fashion choices can be a contributing factor to well-being. And I know that for some people might be a bit of a stretch in terms of what fashion does, but it definitely can improve people's well-being, particularly in terms of self-esteem and self-identity. So my challenge for the industry is not about stopping people buying stuff. It's about how we can work with our consumers to deliver the key positives of fashion, but doing it in a way that decouples some of those environmental and social impacts. And that's the really big challenge here. We can't go back to, let's say 100 years ago, that the only people who engaged in fashion were those people who were rich. That's, for me, also morally questionable. What fast fashion has done is it's given lots of people the opportunity to engage in fashion at a value level. And what we need to do is to try and work out how we can do and deliver those fashion solutions for people, but do it in a way that minimizes the environmental impacts. So I'm hoping I've dodged that question about your self-esteem and your wife, but maybe Savannah's one of the other questions.
Okay, we'll come back to you in a minute, Reinhard, I haven't forgotten. So Steve Fleming, you seem to have had a string of little questions there, one about Boohoo and its relationship to poor worker care, also asking about the brands. I'm not sure whether Mark will be pulled on that one. And your final point is about consumption, which has already come up in a way. But I don't know, Steve, if you wanted to raise a point related to your question. I can't see where you are actually.
Yeah.
Oh yes.
Yeah, it's two of us, but actually it's me. My name's Dawn.
Hello, Dawn.
I was the one that typed it. Yeah, I would be very interested in. I'm always trying to look out for clothing retailers who are ethical and sustainable. But I find it very difficult to identify them without spending a huge amount of time knowing what to actually believe from what they're saying and how much of it is marketing. So my main thing is actually I'm at an age as well where I just buy fewer clothes now, and that's fine. So reducing for me solves it in many ways. But in other when I do want to buy clothes, I want to try and buy it sustainably and ethically. And I was surprised that Boohoo was on that list. because I keep reading a lot about the negatives of Boohoo. So I'd be really interested, especially to do with worker rights. And so I'd just be interested in hearing Mark's view on that. And then also, what are the labels, the brands that he favours and avoids, if he's happy to share some of those.
Yeah, so thanks, Dawn, for that question, those questions. And yes, it is really interesting, the situation with Boohoo. And I think it's fair to say that Boohoo is one of these brands that's grown really quickly. And as a result of growing really quickly, they've not been really completely accountable and fully understanding the impacts that they have. So I'm not here to defend Boohoo in terms of what's happened historically, in terms of some of the issues that they are associated with, particularly in the Leicester clothing industry. But what I find really interesting about Boohoo is they've recognised that there are issues there. They've recognised there are some challenges there, and they are willing to change the way that they operate their business to try and address some of those issues. So in some ways, we have to give brands credit for recognising the limitations they've had and the fact that they're taking action to resolve it. And having spoken to some of the people that work at Boohoo, you know, there is a genuine drive at their senior management to make things better. Now, it's not going to happen overnight, and I am absolutely certain that the media in particular are going to do a lot more digging to find issues with their organisation. But at least they are making efforts to try and resolve what they're doing. What I find really interesting with the media, by the way, is that they tend to find one organisation and focus on them as being the evil, nasty aspect of the industry. And actually, there are lots and lots of brands that sneak under the radar that just are similar to, you know, what Boohoo did previously, but just don't get picked up by the media. And I have a particular issue with luxury brands, for example, because I have and sorry, this is a personal view, by the way, a moral issue around luxury as this divisive part of the industry. But actually, the other reason I have a problem with the luxury industry is that they've tended to be really slow in changing their behaviour, but it's not been picked up by the media. So that for me is an interesting point with Boohoo. Yes, there are some issues there, and there will be more issues. I'm sure they'll be uncovered, but at least they're trying to do the right thing. Now, in terms of which brands I prefer, I'm going to show you a true aspect of consumer irrationality. When I go shopping, even though my specialist area is sustainability of fashion, I'm not really interested in the sustainability of fashion that I wear. And this is a genuine comment. And I justify it because, well, I try to justify it to myself. I justify it because when I buy a garment, I'm going to wear that garment until it falls apart. So I'm getting that full utilization that maybe some of the people that I've talked about in terms of their clothing. But the other thing that I recognize is, in a very strange way, I want to look good in the clothes that I buy, and that's my focus. So I recognize in myself this idea that, yes, I know about the sustainability and I know the challenges, but actually I really want to look good. So I'm a prime example of how crazy consumers are. Now, I won't talk about, putting that to one side, this personal view, I won't talk about the brands that I think are good in terms of fashion, in terms of sustainability. Although I will mention one brand that I do boycott, and that's Amazon. But again, that's another personal story to go on to. But you're absolutely right, Dawn, in terms of trying to work out which brands are doing the right thing. Because when you look at the websites, there's all sorts of stories and all sorts of claims that they're making. And the advice I give to most people is don't look at their main website page. What I would ask you to do is to look at their corporate website. Now, this is the part of the website that their investors would look at, for example. If the brand is doing some good stuff, what you'll find on their corporate website is some details about what they're doing. You'll hopefully find some endorsement or third-party validation of what they're doing. And you should also see a report about what they're doing. And I know people like Next, ASOS, M&S, and others have these corporate responsibility reports. And this is one of the challenges for the fashion industry and for consumers, is to find out whether a brand is good or to find out whether something is sustainable. You have to do quite a bit of legwork, quite a bit of research to find that stuff out. But I genuinely think that a brand that has a corporate website, that has reports, a brand that is actually making public statements about what they want to do, they are generally doing a good thing or trying to do a good thing. It's those brands who are not saying anything about the targets that they've set themselves, brands who are not writing reports, brands who are not talking about the stuff they're doing, are those where there's enough ambiguity there to say, well, maybe they're not doing the right thing and maybe there's a bit of greenwashing going on there. Now, it's a rule of thumb rather than a hard and fast position on that, Dawn, but it is difficult. And I find myself looking at brands going, I don't really know whether they're doing a good thing or not, particularly with the complexity of sustainability that we look at here at the university.
Yeah, thanks very much. Because with Boohoo, I have read, I have also read about how they said that they're going to improve things. And to be honest, I just thought, yeah, well, you're bound to say that now that has happened and you've been all over the press. You're bound to say, now we're going to try and improve things. How do I know, as just an ordinary person, that you actually genuinely are trying to improve things as soon as you go out of the media again? What, did you really care in the first place? And especially when it's happening in Leicester in front of people's noses, it's very difficult to say that they didn't know when it's happening in Leicester, when you could argue they didn't know if it was happening in India. So it's interesting to hear what you just said then. Yeah,
absolutely, Dawn. And just follow up on that, by the way, because the Environmental Audit Committee that I gave a statement to, this is the Environmental Audit Committee for the House of Commons. The first part of that committee discussion was about the environment, and I was able to talk to the MPs about that. The second half was talking about ethical and social issues within the supply chain. Now, in 2015, the government created the Modern Slavery Act, which basically said that any industry, whether it's fashion, automotive, or any business, is responsible for managing modern slavery within their supply chain. The stories that we have about Boohoo are associated with non-compliance to the Modern Slavery Act. And MPs who instigated the Modern Slavery Act were sitting there saying, why don't we know about these instances of modern slavery going on in Leicester under our noses, on our doorstep? And the response across the board was, it's because you politicians have created an act that doesn't work. Those businesses were non-compliant with the law. So why are we waiting for brands to take action when actually it should be the law that's taking action for this non-compliance? Now, this is not to say that Boohoo don't have any responsibility about these things, but I find it really intriguing when politicians challenge the industry about not doing the right thing. And actually what we're seeing here in the Boohoo case was non-compliance with the law. Why isn't the law doing something about it? So that's, sorry, that's a sort of I'm getting on a bit of a rant in terms of politicians, and I shouldn't do that, but there's some really interesting stuff that goes on around some of these stories that we see in the media about who ultimately is responsible for managing some of these issues.
Nice.
Okay. Thanks very much. It's some interesting points that you raised there. I think let's pick up on Reinhardt's point about replacing corporate responsibility with corporate accountability in relation to CSR. So Reinhardt, do you want to just ask this question?
Yes, thank you, Jenny, because I think it fits very well with the previous discussion. And also, I mean, I don't want to say small is good and big is bad, or I think it depends on the responsibility moving to accountability. And I don't know whether everybody is aware, it started in Austria, in Vienna actually. There is a sort of organization called Economy for the Common Good, where companies are certified similar to financial audits, but to others. I mean, if you allow me to share the screen, I can show the matrix if you are interested, or otherwise you can look it up yourself.
Or maybe you can give us a link in the chat.
Yeah, the link is actually in the chat. And so,
yes, okay.
Yeah, so independent assessors assess according to human dignity, environmental, social responsibility, transparency, and co-determination, and give a score. And in this way, companies can be assessed where they stand on these issues. And at the moment, it's voluntary. And I try to think about a clothing company. The one which comes to my mind, because I buy from them because of this, is Vaude. I don't know whether you have heard V-A-U-D-E. Vaude is they are sort of outdoor clothing company, and they are participating and achieved quite a high score. And actually, they say it should be made compulsory, similar to financial accounting. So rather than having responsibility, you have accountability. And similar to financial accounting, they should be then stopped to operate if they fall below a certain score, and therefore are not seen to be responsible for society and for the environment. So Mark, I don't know whether you know about this and what you think about it. And again, I want to thank you for your really stimulating presentation, as you can see from my questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Reinhard. So it's always good to have someone that's sort of interested in what we're talking about here. And you raise a really good point about that nuanced language in terms of corporate responsibility moving to corporate accountability. And I think we are starting to see the growth of that. And it may be, I suspect, particularly in the UK, because of the sort of state of the political landscape at the moment. But I think we may see that growth of accountability happening at a voluntary level to begin with. And that may hopefully grow to be something that can become mandated. But this idea of corporate accountability is a really interesting area. This idea that we set a set of standards to say that a brand, an organization, and this isn't just about fashion, of course, this should be about industry in general, that a brand is compliant with these set of standards. And interestingly enough, that corporate accountability shouldn't stop with the brand. In my view, we should be talking about what investors do with their investments. Who do they invest with and why? And is that a good choice from a sustainability point of view? And we are starting to see corporate investors, institutional investors, and you may have seen already the flotation of Deliveroo in the news recently.
Yes.
So we saw corporate investors saying, you know what, we don't agree with this model, in particular the way that you treat your workers, and we're not going to invest. So in some ways, I think that ties up with that accountability that you're talking about, Reinhard, but it is a very voluntary position at the moment. Now, one of the challenges with this accountability approach is who sets the standard and what those standards are, and how do we measure those standards in an industry which is truly global and is also very opaque in terms of what we can get from the supply chain. I was involved in a project some years ago looking at supply chain traceability, which is linked to this accountability. And it was really challenging to try and get this data out of organizations, to try and work out whether someone was accountable or not. So as a theory, I think it works really well. In practice, there are some big challenges there. But as I say, I think we're going to start to see more of a voluntary movement with this, and those brands who are responsible, who want to do the right thing, are going to start shifting to that accountability. There is one additional issue which actually has been thrown up by some research we've been doing recently, and this is this idea about who sets the standards. So the classic example is about child labour. How do we define what child labour is? Now, according to UK law, children are defined as anyone under the age of 16. But if we go to somewhere like China, they talk about child labour as being defined as someone under the age of 14. And in India, they have a different set of measures altogether. So when we're talking about these legal frameworks in different countries, and we want to set a standard here in the UK, and this is one of the problems with the Modern Slavery Act, if we set a standard and say that children defined in the UK is 16 years old, and if you're a supplier in China, you have to be compliant with UK law, and that supersedes your local law, there's all sorts of issues that arise from that. Now, these are not insurmountable. They're difficult, but they're not insurmountable. But that's one of the challenges that we have within the fashion industry around that accountability approach. But I completely agree with you. And Vaude, and I don't quite know how to pronounce Vaude, by the way. Vaude is a really interesting brand that are doing some really nice stuff about stretching what sustainability actually means and can be for clothing brands.
Interesting. Well, thanks for sharing that with us about Vaude, Reinhard. Yes. Let me come on to somebody else now who's asked the question. Christine, are you there? You had an interesting question about synthetics.
Oh, yes. Well, I was interested that synthetics weren't actually as bad as I thought. In fact, I was shocked at all the water that cotton uses. But on balance, would you be better having cotton because synthetics, when you wash them, do they put a lot of plastics and stuff into the water?
So, Christine, it's a really simple question, and it's a question I really hate answering because it's really hard to answer. And I'll explain what I mean by that. When we're talking about the sustainability of a product, when we're trying to really understand the impact of that product, we need to be taking into account not just the impacts associated with production, but also the impacts that you talk about in terms of washing, for example, but then also thinking about the life cycle. How long does that product last for? And I always refer to what I wear when I go out cycling. So pre-pandemic, I used to do a lot of cycling because I used to cycle from Wakefield to Leeds every day. So I used to do about 25 miles on the bike. And I used to wear a base layer that was made of wool. And that wool base layer is brilliant. I would highly recommend wool as a base layer for anyone that's going out doing walking or what have you. The downside to the wool base layer is after about constant wear of 2 years, it just falls apart. It just disintegrates because I use it so much. So I then have to go out and buy another wool base layer. Now I could, and in fact I did 20 years ago, I did buy a Helly Hansen base layer. Has anyone got one of those Helly walking tops? You know, it's got it's normally navy blue with white stripes down it. Now, in fact, I bought it 30 years ago, and it's made of polypropylene. It's made of plastic. I've still got it. I still use it. I still wear it. So in terms of the overall impact of that product, I could argue that that product, that polypropylene, that plastic product made from oil, probably has a much lower environmental footprint compared to a naturally made product, that wool base layer. So to answer your question, it really does depend, and this is the difficulty again in terms of fashion and clothing. It really does depend on what you as a consumer do with it. I mean, if you buy a cotton T-shirt and wear it literally until it falls apart and all you've got left is the seams, that's going to be significantly more sustainable than buying a polyester T-shirt and throwing that away after 5 wears. But that's not just because of the material, it's because of the way that you've worn it. So this is the real challenge here in terms of answering that question, which is why when people ask me the question and I answer it, most people look at me and go, yeah, that's not a suitable answer. I want to know, the rights and wrongs, but it genuinely is just really difficult to work out.
But just to perhaps follow up on Christina's point, for example, you talked about your I don't know how to pronounce it. Yeah, the
polypropylene
footwear. Yeah, that you wore. I mean, does that shed any microplastics? Because I mean, one of the issues presumably with some of these products is that this is shedding going on, which is contributing to microplastics in the environment. So that could be a significant issue. But I just wondered in that case whether that was true or not.
Yes, so we've got a research. Well, we're on our 3rd research project looking at microplastics and trying to understand the dynamics of what's going on there. And yes, all garments will release microfibers of some sort, whether it's a polypropylene or polyester, or whether it's cotton, whether it's wool. It will release these microfibers. Now, what happens to those microfibers when they get into the ocean is a really contested area at the moment. There are some academics down in Plymouth, for example, who for years have talked about the impact, the negative impact that those microfibers have on ecosystems, things like mussels, for example. That same research group 2 years ago, or sorry, 18 months ago, said that actually microfibers, microplastics are benign to mussels. They have no impact at all. They just go straight through the animal. So no issues. So there's some really big issues there in terms of the impact. And that's not to say that we shouldn't be thinking about this. It's really to say that we don't know, in all honesty, what the answer to that is, because we know that there is significant quantities of cotton that go into the ocean. And this cotton doesn't always biodegrade as quickly as we think it would do in the ocean environment. We don't know what happens when animals, marine animals eat the cotton and what happens to it. But taking a step back from that, and it is important to be thinking about microplastics and microfibers, and the health of the oceans is really important. But if we were to stop all of the plastics going into the ocean today, we would still have a massive issue in terms of climate change. The way that climate change is interacting with oceans is hugely significant, and it's not related to microplastics. It's related to carbon in the atmosphere. We are seeing significant challenges to species. We're seeing sea level temperature rises. We're seeing changes in salinity. We are seeing all sorts of issues. And for me, yes, we need to work out what's going on with microplastics. But the big challenge here, we're running out of time. I'm sorry to depress people on this and say it again, we are running out of time in terms of climate change. And that's where we need to see real movement. And that's why I don't get too excited about microplastics, in all honesty. The big challenge is what temperature you're washing your garments at, for example, because that has a climate, that has a footprint. How much energy you're using in your house in terms of heating. It's that big picture thing that, is really, it's the thing that keeps me awake at night.
Thank you. Right, a question here from Steve Fleming about if brands are putting out several collections a year, like Zara and Boohoo and various other ones, is this sustainable? Steve, if you're there, do you want to, is Steve still there? No, maybe he's left.
Yes.
Yeah.
I heard a yes. Oh, there you go. Yes.
Sorry, I thought there were two of us here under Steve.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, was it
you asked the
question? Okay, about the putting out several brands a year, several collections a year, whether that is sustainable or not. Yeah, like Zara, for example, has several, 20 collections in a year and that they put out. And it used to be like a summer collection, the winter collection that clothes shops used to put out. But now you seem to be getting lots and lots of changing and renewed fashion all the time. And I just wonder where the things go that don't get sold. And it must presumably a lot of it's getting thrown away. But then it just encourages us to keep buying more and more, which obviously the shops want to make more profit. But at the same time, it's just not conducive to being sustainable.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting challenge. So when I first started in the industry many years ago, we had two seasons. It was the spring summer season and the autumn winter season. And I have to say, as time went on, we increased the number of seasons. We had all the number of phases of collections that we were launching, and it was really hard work. I don't think there's any brand out there that likes to have so many seasons going on. But it's one of those, it's one of those sort of the momentums that's built up in the industry that, your competitors are doing 4 seasons and therefore they're getting more customers. Therefore, we have to do 4 seasons. And the position that we see with most brands now is that they have at least, so they'll have 4 seasons, and within each season, they will have 2 phases. And within each of those phases, they'll have mini collections going on. And it's really, really complex. And I really feel sorry for my ex-colleagues who are still involved in that. And brands, in many ways, I would argue, don't want to do that. But it's one of the ways that they compete. And that's not to say all of the fault is with consumers for demanding that, because we didn't demand more seasons. It's just part of that really interesting symbiotic relationship that develops. Now, I think the challenge for us here is I don't think we can go backwards to 2 seasons, not without very significant action from government, for example, to say to brands, you're going to have to stop doing this. I think that the challenge is to look at this in a different way, is to say, how can we change the model in terms of how retailers and brands work to still provide that sort of constantly changing view of fashion, but do it in a way that is more sustainable. And this is an area that's really interesting now in terms of business models that are being developed. We are now seeing brands toying with the idea of rental models, for example, or toying with the idea of leasing garments. So in that way, what you do when you finish with that garment at the end of the season, whatever that may be, is you return it back to the brand. And they incentivize you to return it. So you can then go and buy, or sorry, not buy, go and rent or lease another garment. So there's some really interesting models that are being developed around that. And again, some of the fast fashion brands are doing some really interesting stuff. I don't know if you saw in the news recently that Asda is now selling secondhand clothing. So some interesting changes that are going on. In terms of product that isn't sold in stores, most of the, well, in fact, all of the brands I've ever worked with, either when I was in the industry or as an academic, I would argue all of those brands have a really, really tight control over their profit. And they will not throw garments away. Even if those garments are at the end of the season and they can't sell them to a consumer in their store, they'll try and sell it wholesale. Or actually, and I know a number of brands that do this, and fast fashion brands in particular, some of them that I've mentioned today, if they can't sell it and they can't shift it through wholesale or they can't shift it through any commercial route, they will donate that clothing to a charity. So the Salvation Army, New Life, and even Oxfam will receive end-of-line products from fast fashion brands. In terms of luxury brands, and this is where I'm going to, have a personal view again, luxury brands don't do that. They work on a very different profitability scale, and they don't want their products going into the open market. So, as I say, there are some brands who, rather than donate their product to a charity or try and sell it at a cheaper price, they will burn that product to make sure that no one gets it. And that, to me, is from a personal point of view, is immoral, because of all of the effort put into making that garment, and then they burn it. I just can't agree with that at all. So yeah, I think the challenge we've got here is a really important one you raised, that we've got these brands. So H&M, for example, I mentioned doing some really good stuff in terms of their sustainability impact, but they're selling even more stuff. So it sort of counterbalances, offsets the good work they're doing. So they are looking at new models, and I'm sure we're going to see more of those new models coming through that help us navigate our way through having new fashion all the time, but doing it in a more sustainable way.
Thanks.
I think Richard has a question which I think fits in with what we're just saying. Richard? Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah.
Great.
So you mentioned the fact that companies seem to be taking the lead on developing the sustainability indices, and you've mentioned a couple of times government, and it seems to me that a failure of the sort of neoliberal model that we've got, certainly in the West, is the fact that we've left everything to the market. And the one thing that COVID has shown is that there's a role for government, a clear and dynamic role for government. And it seems to me, if we're going to solve the climate crisis, that government needs to step up to the plate and take the lead. What do you think government should be doing in the fashion industry then?
Well, Richard, I totally endorse some of the comments you made there, that the relaxation and reliance on market dynamics has proved to be very, it's almost fatal to the climate dialogue that we've got going on at the moment. And many brands actually also recognise this as well. So I do know that a number of brands lobbied the government back in 2013 and 2014 to say to them that their plans around the Modern Slavery Act was just not strong enough. So there are brands out there that are demanding that the government take action around these things. And the reason that they're demanding that is because up until now, those brands who are trying to act responsibly are doing the best they can, but while competing with brands who are not doing the right thing, who don't have to pay the price or not willing to pay the price for being sustainable. So there is a growing movement within UK retail that is essentially saying to government, you need to take some action here. We need to use their phrase, level the playing field. And this is, it's not rocket science, it's about setting some really clear basic standards. It's going back to some of the things that Reinhardt, I think, was alluding to in terms of this accountability, is this idea that government could and should step up to the plate around these things. But I don't know, well, having engaged with government at different levels, with different organisations, I know many people within the civil service are trying to do the right thing. But because of the complexity of the fashion industry, and because the government hasn't engaged in the fashion and textile industry for such a long time, they have little or no understanding of the complexity of it and how it works. So we're working with, and in fact, we've got a conversation going on at the moment where we're looking at trying to put forward policy ideas to government around managing waste, for example, to help them understand what they can do. But whether they listen, I don't know, and whether they take action quickly enough, I don't know. But there are some very important things that government could do that would readjust that balance, level the playing field, which would have a significant impact, definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Interesting. Just looking here, a question from Christine about whether profits will be affected if second-hand clothes become more acceptable, and one from Harvey about online retailers. So maybe a quick question, because we're rapidly getting close to the end now. Christine, a quick question from you on about the second-hand clothes, and then Harvey, maybe about online retailers.
Well, I think I've more or less got it answered, but I'd forgotten about people turning on Deliveroo. But Asda are doing second-hand clothes, and I just wondered whether it would last or whether it was just a publicity stunt.
Good question, and I wish I knew the answer to that. Although I do know other brands have tried selling second-hand product in the past, and they've stopped doing it. So that sort of gives an indication that this is quite a difficult area for a brand to navigate. However, it's important to recognise that, particularly with COVID, we are starting to see consumers changing their habits around fashion, and maybe for certain consumers, second-hand clothing will become more and more acceptable. And maybe Asda have started this at the right time, but I guess only time will tell in terms of whether it actually works or doesn't work.
So they're seeing the market opportunities, the way the winds are blowing as usual. Yeah. Anyway, but that is positive if it's going to get people to use second-hand clothes. Yes, Harvey is raising this interesting issue that has increased during COVID, I think, about the whole business of online retailers. Harvey, do you want to mention?
Yeah, I was just following on from the comments you mean about Boohoo and, I mean, ASOS. I've got 3 girls who essentially just seem to don't try anything on, just but get it delivered and then send it back most often than not. And you know, it just doesn't seem to be compliant with what you're saying about people trying to develop sustainable models. I mean, it's a bigger issue than that, obviously, isn't it, in terms of sort of being able to compete against the high street as well. But that's just my observation of it. Just seems to be pilot high, sell it cheap.
And you're absolutely right, Harvey. You're not the first parent to mention this, particularly as I deal with 18 and 19-year-olds in my lecture courses. And there's a very large warehouse in Selby that is associated with one of the biggest online brands in the UK. I went to visit that warehouse. That warehouse deals purely in returns. And it's and I've been to some big warehouses. This is a massive warehouse up in Selby. And they deal purely in returns, and at certain times of the year, for every 6 garments that they dispatch from their warehouse down in Barnsley, they'll get 5 garments coming back to their warehouse in Selby. Now, is that the fault of the brand? Is that the fault of the consumer, or is it a combination of trying to meet consumers' need in terms of convenience, while not taking into account some of the impacts. And I think this is, again, part of that symbiotic relationship, that there's no one party that is culpable in this. It's part of that symbiotic relationship. And what we need to be thinking about is how we can minimize that. There are some very significant issues, both environmental footprint in terms of carbon and packaging associated with this process of buying 5 and returning 4. There are also some social issues, particularly raised during the COVID situation with delivery drivers and their working conditions and contracts. And how do we resolve that? Well, an individual brand acting unilaterally will probably end up losing market share and profitability. Therefore, we need to be thinking about government action, possibly as a solution to that. But it is a big challenge. And part of that challenge, and I'm sure, Harvey, your daughters probably spend a bit of time on social media. And social media drives all sorts of different behaviours. It's changed the landscape for young people. And I don't engage in social media. I'm just too old. I'm a bit of a Luddite. And I don't blame young people for the impact of social media, because again, brands and social media platforms play on this idea of hedonistic and psychogenic needs that we all have, and create desires, and they just play with the hard wiring that we have in our psychology. So it's a really difficult one to unpick. And I don't know the solution to the problem you have, Harvey, although I don't have children myself, but I have got a cellar in my house. And if my kids behaved like that, I think I'd lock them in the cellar. But don't please take that as a recommendation or a guidance on what to do. Don't quote me on that, please.
I just see that there's maybe a slightly different point that's being raised by Steve, which is, maybe we'll end on that one. Steve Fleming, about whether there are any international agreements or proposed agreements between governments that would help to improve sustainability of the fashion industry. Steve, where's Steve gone?
Hello, yes.
Yeah. Oh, yes, there you are. Yes.
Yeah.
So that interesting point. Yes.
Yeah, it's really interesting what you say about shareholders and stakeholders putting pressure on companies to act in a more sustainable way. But I wondered whether there was any specific international agreements or proposed agreements between governments that would help push things in the right direction. And if not, would that be something that would be the next logical stage?
Yeah, so the answer, I think, is no, that there are no formal government actions happening globally on this. And part of the reason for that is because of this difference between supply and demand. Here in the UK, where we buy clothing, we want to reduce the amount of clothing that we're buying because that has very obvious impacts for the positive. Those countries that are manufacturing garments and producing textiles don't want to see that turned down. So when you talk to cotton farmers, they want you to buy their cotton, and they want you to buy lots of cotton because it's their livelihood that you're supporting there. So there's a real tension between some of the solutions that people are talking about. So no, I don't think there's any real strong government action going on there. But the good news is that there are global initiatives that are happening at a business level. So there's the Global Fashion Agenda. There are things like the Sustainable Action Coalition. There are things like ZBHC. There are initiatives that are going on trying to get a momentum behind good practice to make things happen underneath the legal framework. But by doing it underneath the legal framework, hopefully we can see action happening faster. Obviously, the issue with being under the legal framework means that we don't get compliance across the industry. But I'm not sure whether we're ever going to get to a position where we get global agreement, because we can't get global agreement on climate change. You look at the issues that we see between the United States and China, for example. So I'm not that enthusiastic that we're going to get an answer there. But it's not all doom and gloom, I think, at this point at the moment.
Thank you very much.
Right, I think we'll probably come to the end now. We are recording, Mark has let us record this program so that you can go back and listen and maybe see the chat as well. I mean, it's been very, very interesting, actually, very wide ranging, and raised a lot of very fascinating issues. It certainly made it even more complex for me. I knew it was complex before, but I'm left, you know, in a sort of dilemma, because I take the point, you know, you're making that, you know, farmers in many countries rely on producing cotton. There are many garment workers in Bangladesh, a country I know quite well, who've gained hugely, you know, that they've been raised out of poverty because of their work in the garment industry. And yet there's so many issues to do with climate change now that are very pressing for all of us, and which seems to me, you know, I know many people have mentioned this tonight, it leads to the idea of reducing our consumption. I think what I've taken positively from your talk is that, you know, there are some actually interesting things going on, and young people are often, you know, very involved in this, like, you know, organizations like, well, the whole idea of upcycling, recycling, reusing, vintage, you know, there's lots of new organizations popping up that are working on this, but it's not huge. It's still not huge. It's still quite niche, I think, and how you move people further forward is the big issue. But anyway, you really helped us, I think, to sort of frame some of these issues tonight. So a big thank you. I know some people have left, but if you want to unmute yourself, and we'll give you a hand for the people who are left behind. There's some nice comments though left behind, Mark, about your talk, including one from a friend of mine called Andy, who says he will still continue. Food for thought, I'll still keep on skip dipping for my wardrobe. He gets his clothes from skips, and he's been doing that ever since I've known him. Thanks very much, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you.
Really good.